Most historians now agree that the tale of King Arthur rose from a true hero who fought against Germanic tribes after the Romans left Britain in 409 AD. After the Roman army left, there was a power vacuum that was quickly filled with Germanic invaders commonly known as the Anglo-Saxons. Now these tribes were from Angland, which is where the modern name England comes from, Saxony and Jutland. To make things worse, the Britons themselves were fractured into separate kingdoms. The lack of a strong Roman military presence had removed the central governmental structure, leading to infighting and the creation of a multitude of separate military factions. In this dark age, shadowy figures would emerge to occasionally unite and focus the Britons against the advance of the Anglo-Saxons. Key amongst these were Ambrosius Aurelianus and Riofarmus. Ambrosius Aurelianus, who is mentioned by Gildas and other early sources, was a Romano-British leader who fought against the Anglo-Saxons in post-Roman Britain. Riofarmus, a king of the Britons, is noted in continental sources like Jordanus as having led military expeditions to Gaul in the 470s. We do not know if Arthur was based on one of these men, a combination of both, or just completely made up. But the story of Arthur serves as a far greater purpose. The tale of King Arthur is not simply one book, but a collection of different works written throughout the Middle Ages. Therefore, it reflects the changing cultural attitudes of England throughout history. Most people have a basic understanding of the story of King Arthur. We've all grown up watching movies about him, but when you dig deep into the story, it all gets a little bit murkier. If you are looking for historical accuracy past this point, I simply cannot help you. Although Arthur might have been based on a real person, the stories I'm about to tell you are all fictional. Let's get into the tale of King Arthur throughout the full timeline. So the earliest tales of King Arthur come from the mid-10th century Welsh chronicle, the Annales Cambrai. This work does not go into too much detail, but it says that in 516 AD, King Arthur won the Battle of Badon, a major conflict against the Saxons. Another entry claims that in 537 AD, both Arthur and Mordred fell at the Battle of Camlan. Again, I want to reiterate that these events were chronicled 400 years after the events supposedly took place. So again, take everything you hear with a pinch of salt. In the early 12th century, we get Geoffrey of Monmouth's Historia Regum Britannia, which is the earliest written Arthurian story that we would recognise, as it includes characters such as Merlin, Guinevere, the traitor Mordred, as well as the strife of Camlan, the island of Avalon, and Arthur's beloved sword, Caliburn, which would later be Frenchified to Excalibur. More on that later. Monmouth's story goes as follows. The king of Britain, Uther Pendragon, was at war with the Saxon invaders. But more importantly than that, he really wanted to sleep with this lady named Igraine, who is married to his friend Galoris, the Duke of Cornwall. Now the two men go to war over this, and Merlin, who is depicted as a classical druid with vaguely mentioned magical powers, helps Uther by shapeshifting him to make him look like Galoris so he can trick Igraine into sleeping with him, which I think we can all agree is just plain wrong. Anyway, this is how Arthur is born. Uther gets poisoned by the Saxons, and his illegitimate son Arthur becomes king at age just 15. Arthur goes on to conquer a ridiculous amount of northern Europe, such as Ireland, Iceland, Norway, and even the Roman province of Gaul. Now, again, I must reiterate that this is fiction, as we know that England did not conquer Gaul during this period. Back to the story. Arthur goes on to fight Rome, but his nephew Mordred marries his wife Guinevere and usurps him. Arthur comes back to fight Mordred at the infamous Camelot. Arthur defeats and kills Mordred, but is fatally wounded in doing so. He gets taken away to the magical island of Avalon by his sister Morgan Le Fay, so he can heal. Now let's get back into the whole Excalibur thing. Avalon is mentioned as a place where the sword was originally forged. The name was originally Caliburn, which itself is a Latinized version of the Welsh word, which I have absolutely no chance of pronouncing, but by all means give it a go for yourself. Caliburn is not magic at this point, it's just a really good sword. So, this story became so popular that other writers go on to produce what can best be described as fan fiction to add to the original tale over the coming centuries. This is where the character Lancelot comes from, and the relationship between Lancelot and Guinevere is interesting as Lancelot basically steals Arthur's wife. However, this is why I mentioned earlier that the story of King Arthur is significant as it shows the changing social values of the country over time. You see, during the 12th century, you have the introduction of courtly love. This was an idealized form of love, focusing on chivalry, admiration, and an often unattainable romance between a lowly knight and a lady of higher social standing. The concept of courtly love was first introduced into Europe through the influence of Arabic poetry after the First Crusade. Lancelot and Guinevere are not considered wrong for pursuing their love during this time period. Remember, Arthur himself was conceived when his father, King Uther, slept with another man's wife. However, in the 13th century, we get another addition to the tale with the Vulgate cycle. This does a lot to Christianize the story. It adds the Holy Grail, and Lancelot is now considered a traitor for pursuing Guinevere, the wife of his friend and his king. Here we also get more context on the character Merlin. Prior to the Vulgate cycle, the character of Merlin is left vague. Merlin is now portrayed as a mysterious and wise wizard with supernatural abilities. He serves as a loyal advisor and protector of Arthur, guiding key events that shape Arthur's destiny, such as the Sword in the Stone. Merlin's origin story is complex. He is said to have been born of a mortal woman and a demonic spirit, giving him knowledge of both human and magical realms. However, he is vulnerable and he falls prey to his love from the enchantress Vivian, who traps him in a magical prison. One thing that I find really interesting about the Vulgate cycle is that although it Christianizes the story, it also adds a lot of traditional Celtic pagan elements. This includes the Lady of the Lake, who is supernatural without being divine, and the Green Knight, whose regenerative abilities represent Celtic pagan symbolism of death and rebirth. Later versions of the story further paganize the story. In the 15th century, we get Sir Thomas Malory's Le Morte d'Arthur. In this version, we are told that Excalibur was a gift from the Lady of the Lake, and the sword itself is supernatural. So the story gets simultaneously more Christian and more pagan as time goes on. After Malory's version, we get a couple of centuries of a break in the storytelling, with people now seemingly more concerned with whether or not the story is true and Arthur himself ever existed. Now again, this represents the societal change as we enter the Renaissance, a time when science and pragmatism was more important than storytelling and myth. It wasn't until the 19th century that the story became popular again. Modern Arthurian storytelling takes a different approach. You see, Geoffrey's original work was supposed to be telling a fictionalized version of an actual historical event that really happened. Later versions were romanticized as they were heavily influenced by courtly love. The Vulgate cycle heavily Christianized the story, and modern writing, instead of adding to the story, often chooses to rewrite the tale for completely the purposes of characterization at the expense of storytelling. In early versions, the story is important and the characters serve the purpose of aiding the story. Modern versions, however, the story takes a backseat and can be changed to serve the purpose of character development. Sometimes Lancelot is a bad guy for betraying the noble King Arthur. Sometimes he's the good guy who loves Guinevere, and therefore Arthur will now be portrayed as a neglectful husband. Even Mordred goes from being Arthur's nephew to his son. In the original version, Mordred usurps Arthur on his own volition, whereas modern writers make him a puppet of Morgan Le Fay. Arthur is no longer the good guy who gets betrayed by the evil Mordred. He is a kind of jerk who has an illegitimate son, and therefore the usurping is a consequence of his own misdeeds. Either way, the tale of King Arthur is significant in the history of England and remains popular until this very day. Regardless of whether or not Arthur was real, he is one of the most important figures in English literature history. Thank you for watching. If you have enjoyed this video, I would really appreciate it if you could leave a like and subscribe. I'm only a small channel, it really helps me out massively. Thank you very much and have a good day.